They laughed when the flatbed truck rolled down the dirt road carrying what looked like half a metal barrel turned on its side. Gus Brennan, the most respected builder in Ravalli County, stood in my driveway that July afternoon and shook his head like a man watching someone dig their own grave. He wasn't alone in his judgment. By December, every person within 20 miles of Darby was talking about the war veteran who'd lost his mind building a tin can instead of a proper log cabin. They called it a grain silo, a culvert pipe, a steel coffin. Some laughed. Others felt genuine pity for my wife and daughter. But when January brought temperatures that dropped to 44 below zero, something impossible happened inside that curved metal shell. The air inside held steady at temperatures 71 degrees warmer than the frozen hell outside. My daughter Nora, 5 years old with asthma, severe enough that cold air could trigger bronchial spasms that might kill her, slept through those brutal nights without a single cough. She woke each morning in a home where her breath didn't fog, where her feet touched a floor that didn't steal warmth from her body, where the corners held no pockets of air cold enough to make her lungs seize. Today you'll understand why the worst idea in Bitterroot Valley became the most copied design across 3 counties, and how a structure everyone mocked outperformed every traditional cabin when survival became the only measure that mattered. I'm Garrett Thorne. 28 years old in the spring of 1947, when I returned to Montana with a duffel bag, a military pension that wouldn't stretch far, and plans to disappear into the wilderness I'd grown up believing I understood. 3 years as a construction battalion engineer in the Aleutian Islands had taught me things the valley's builders had never needed to learn. I'd built structures that had to withstand winds that peeled corrugated steel, like paper cold that turned diesel fuel to sludge conditions that killed men who made mistakes. The islands were a laboratory where physics mattered more than tradition, where the wrong choice meant frozen pipes at best and dead men at worst. I'd measured temperatures inside Quonset huts during storms that would have shredded any log structure. I'd watched rocket stoves heat spaces with a fraction of the wood traditional fireplaces consumed. I'd learned that survival engineering wasn't about what looked right or felt traditional. It was about what worked when nature stopped caring about your heritage. The valley hadn't changed. Same families, same methods, same cabins that had stood for generations. The same brutal winters that consumed stacks of firewood taller than a man and still left families huddled near fires wearing coats indoors, accepting cold as the price of living in Montana. My wife Lorelei, who everyone called Lori, had trusted me enough to leave Anchorage and come to this place where I promised we'd build a life. She was 26 strong in ways that had nothing to do with physical strength, the kind of woman who could smile while carrying fear that would break other people. Our daughter Nora was everything fragile and precious, wrapped in a 5-year-old body that couldn't handle what Montana winters did to the air. The doctors in Anchorage had been clear: keep her warm, keep the temperature stable, cold air causes bronchospasm, rapid temperature changes trigger attacks. If you can't control her environment, you're gambling with her life every day. I bought 30 acres near the Bitterroot Mountains, 6 miles west of Darby, 3 miles from the nearest neighbor. The land was perfect. Clean air, mountain views, isolation that would let us build exactly what we needed without interference. The previous owner had cleared a space for a cabin, but never built it. He'd given up and moved to California, which told me everything about how hard Montana could be for people who came unprepared. Lori stood on that empty land in April and asked the question I knew she would. Where will we live? I pointed to the clearing and told her we'd build something different. Something that would keep Nora safe. She nodded, trusting me the way she always had, but I saw the worry in her eyes. She'd grown up in Seattle, where winter meant rain, not the kind of cold that could kill. Before I bought materials, before I drew plans, I spent September measuring. Silas Whitmore was our closest neighbor, a farmer in his mid-30s who worked the land the way his father had. Good man, hard worker. His cabin was typical Montana construction. Notched logs chinked with moss and claystone fireplace on the north wall, wooden floor raised on posts. It looked exactly like what a Montana cabin should look like. It was also a thermal disaster. I visited on a cool September evening when the temperature outside hit 45 degrees. Nothing severe. Just autumn preparing everyone for what was coming. Silas had a fire going. His wife Constance, who went by Connie, was cooking dinner. Their 3 children were doing homework at a table near the fire. I had a pocket thermometer. Silas thought I was checking the weather. I was documenting failure. 74 degrees Fahrenheit 3 feet from the fireplace, 47 degrees in the corner farthest from the fire, 33 degrees at floor level where their youngest child was sitting. The heat rose straight up and out through gaps in the roof construction. Cold air poured in through the floorboards. Every junction where logs met was a thermal bridge conducting warmth straight through to the outside air. The fireplace itself was pulling more warm air up the chimney than it was radiating into the room. The Whitmore children were wearing sweaters indoors in September. Connie looked tired in a way that went beyond the normal exhaustion of raising 3 kids. Silas was already splitting wood for winter, building a stack that would take months to burn through. This was normal. This was how it had always been done. This was what would kill my daughter. I went home that night and held Nora while she slept. Her breathing was clear in the temporary shelter. We'd built a small, insulated structure that was meant to last until we finished the real house. Lori sat beside me in the lamplight. We didn't speak. We both understood what I'd seen at the Whitmore place. A traditional Montana cabin built with skill and care by a good man couldn't protect Nora. The cold spots would find her. The temperature swings would trigger attacks. We'd spend every winter in fear, listening to her breathe, waiting for the cough that meant we needed to rush her to a doctor 6 miles away over roads that might be impassable. I couldn't accept that. I wouldn't build something that looked right and felt traditional if it meant gambling with my daughter's life every day for the next 15 years. The Quonset hut I ordered was Navy surplus, 22 feet long, 14 feet wide at the base, curved metal ribs covered in corrugated steel, the kind of structure the military threw up in hours for equipment storage or temporary housing in the Pacific Theater. Not a log in sight. The catalog called it practical and efficient. The man I ordered it from in Great Falls asked what I was planning to store in it. Tools, I told him, equipment. He didn't need to know I was planning to live in it with my family. The deposit took most of what I'd saved. The balance would come due on delivery. Lori looked at the catalog photograph and tried to understand. It looks like a tunnel. That's exactly what it is, I said. A tunnel that traps heat instead of letting it escape. She nodded slowly. Her trust in me was absolute, which made the weight of responsibility even heavier. The truck arrived on a July afternoon when the temperature was pushing 90 degrees. The driver had never delivered anything to this part of Montana before. He kept looking at his map like it might be wrong. We were 6 miles from town up a road that was barely maintained. When he finally found our land, he seemed relieved to be dropping his load and leaving. The Quonset came in sections, curved ribs, sheets of corrugated metal, hardware to bolt it all together. It sat there in the clearing looking like exactly what the neighbors would later call it. A giant pipe, a culvert, something that belonged on a construction site, not as someone's home. I stood looking at it and saw something different. I saw a structure with no corners for cold air to pool in, no ridgeline where heat could gather and escape, a continuous arch where every square inch of interior surface would be equidistant from the center, creating natural convection. No thermal bridges, no log junctions bleeding warmth into the night. The shape itself was a heat trap. Word spread fast in a place where everyone knew everyone else's business. By the next morning, Silas had stopped by to see what I was doing. He stood looking at the pile of metal and asked the obvious question. "You building a storage shed?" "No," I said. "This is our house." The silence lasted long enough to be uncomfortable. Silas was a kind man who believed in letting people make their own choices, but I could see him struggling with what to say. His eyes kept moving from the Quonset parts to where Lori was hanging laundry to where Nora was playing in the dirt with sticks. Finally, he asked if I was sure about this. My answer was simple. "I'm sure Nora needs to stay warm." He nodded like he understood, but the doubt was clear in his expression. "That's going to be awfully cold in winter metal like that." "Not with the right insulation and heat retention," I said. He didn't argue. "Montana people didn't tell you that you were wrong. They just waited for winter to do it for them." Everett Calhoun was next. He was a trapper who'd been in the Bitterroot Valley for 30 years, 58 years old with a face that looked like leather left in the sun. He knew these mountains better than anyone knew how to read. Weather knew what it took to survive when the temperature dropped and stayed dropped for weeks. He pulled up in his truck one afternoon and stood looking at the Quonset with his arms crossed. "Is that a grain silo or what?" "It's a Quonset hut. Military surplus. Going to live in it." Everett walked around the pile of metal parts like he was examining an animal he'd never seen before. "Well," he said finally, "I've seen men try stranger things. Most of them didn't make it." I appreciated his honesty more than I appreciated false encouragement. By the time Gus Brennan showed up, the story had reached every household within 20 miles. Gus was 63 years old and had been building cabins in Montana since before I was born. 35 years of experience. 16 cabins that people pointed to as examples of master craftsmanship. When Gus Brennan built something, it stood for generations. When Gus Brennan said something about construction, people listened like he was delivering commandments. He drove up in his truck with his son Fletcher riding beside him. Fletcher was 24, learning the trade from his father, already building a reputation as a skilled carpenter. They walked to where I was marking out the foundation and stood there until I looked up. "Gus didn't waste time on pleasantries. I hear you're planning to live in that metal contraption." "That's right." He looked at Nora, who was playing nearby, then back at me. "You've got a child who needs protecting. I respect that, but this is a mistake, a bad one." I stood up and faced him. I'd known this conversation was coming. "Explain why it's a mistake." Gus pointed at the Quonset. "Metal conducts cold. You're building a heat sink, not a shelter. First hard frost, that thing will be colder inside than out." I shook my head. "Not with 3 inches of sawdust insulation and a thermal mass floor." Gus's expression didn't change. "Insulation doesn't matter when you're wrapped in metal. And I see you're planning to heat it with some kind of toy stove." He was looking at the rocket stove I'd been building. "That's not a toy. It's a high-efficiency combustion system. Burns wood at 1500 degrees with almost no smoke." Gus actually laughed. Not a mean laugh, just the sound of a man who'd seen young fools before. "Son, you need mass. A real fireplace with stones that hold heat. That little thing won't heat a space this size when it's 40 below." I explained about the thermal mass bench. 720 pounds of river stones that would absorb heat during burns and radiate it for hours afterward. Gus cut me off. 700 pounds won't save you when the real cold comes. You need 2,000 pounds of stone in a proper fireplace. You need a firebox that can hold a night's worth of logs. You need thickness and mass and proven methods." He paused and his voice softened slightly. "This isn't the Pacific. This is Montana. 40 below will find every weakness in that design, and there are a lot of weaknesses." I watched him leave Fletcher following behind like a shadow. The younger Brennan glanced back once before they drove away. The look on his face wasn't mockery. It was pity. Lori found me standing in the clearing after they'd gone. She didn't ask what Gus had said. She'd been close enough to hear most of it. Instead, she put her hand on my arm and asked the question that mattered. "Are you sure this will work?" I turned to face her, seeing the fear she was trying to hide, seeing the trust that was costing her something to maintain. "I built structures that survived conditions worse than Montana winters. I understand heat transfer, convection, thermal mass, insulation values. This isn't hope or theory. This is physics." She held my eyes for a long moment. "Then we'd better get building, because people are watching and they're all waiting for us to fail." I dug the foundation 20 inches deep into clay hardpan that was hard as concrete. The depth mattered. Below the frost line, where ground temperature stayed relatively constant, I framed it with lumber and poured concrete mixed with river stones I'd gathered from the creek that ran through our property. Nora helped me carry the smaller stones. Each one, she said, was going to help keep her warm. She was right, though she didn't understand the physics. Those stones would absorb heat during the day and release it slowly at night. Thermal mass wasn't complicated. It was just patience made physical. Heat in, heat out, but slowly enough to matter. Connie Whitmore brought a pie one afternoon in August and stood watching me work on the foundation. The metal structure was starting to take shape by then. The curved ribs were in place, creating that distinctive tunnel shape. She looked at it with poorly hidden concern. "What's that going to be like inside warm?" I said. "Warmer than any cabin in the valley." She didn't argue, but I could tell she didn't believe me. "Silas burned so much wood." Her voice trailed off. She was too polite to say what she meant. "Your family is going to freeze." I appreciated her concern more than I appreciated Gus's certainty. At least Connie was worried for the right reasons. The insulation went up in layers. First, I attached sawdust packed between tar paper sheets to the inside of the metal ribs, 3 inches thick. Sawdust was what people used in ice houses because it worked. It trapped air in millions of tiny pockets, creating barriers that heat couldn't cross easily. The tar paper kept moisture out. Over that, I added a second layer of wood planking to create an air gap. Dead air space is one of the best insulators nature provides. The final interior surface would be smooth planking that Lori could clean and maintain. The whole assembly created a sandwich. Metal exterior air gap, sawdust insulation, air gap, wood interior. Heat would have to fight through multiple barriers to escape. Cold would have to do the same to get in. Fletcher Brennan showed up one afternoon without his father. He walked around the partially completed structure, studying the insulation system, the foundation, the way I was setting up the ventilation. "You really think this is going to work?" I stopped what I was doing and looked at him. He was young enough that certainty and doubt were still fighting for dominance in his worldview. "I know it's going to work. The physics are sound." Fletcher kicked at a piece of scrap wood. "My father is built through 40 Montana winters." "No," I said. "Your father is built through 35, and he's built the same thing 35 times because that's what he learned from his father. There's nothing wrong with tradition when tradition is optimal, but when tradition is just habit wearing the mask of wisdom, it's worth questioning." Fletcher didn't have an answer for that. He left without saying anything else, but I'd seen something in his expression. He was thinking. That was more than most people were willing to do. The rocket stove was the piece I'd spent the most time planning. J-shaped combustion chamber built from fire brick and clay, the inlet at the base where air would enter, the vertical chamber where wood would burn, the horizontal exhaust that would run through the thermal mass bench before exiting through a small chimney. The design created a self-sustaining draft. Air would flow up through the burning wood, creating temperatures hot enough to combust the smoke itself. Almost complete combustion meant almost no waste. The exhaust gases would travel horizontally through 7 feet of river stones before exiting. All that heat would transfer to the mass. The stones would hold it and release it slowly over 18 to 20 hours. 1 burn in the morning, 1 in the evening. That would be enough. Everything I'd learned in the Aleutians said it would be enough. Ida Brennan came alone one afternoon in late August. She was Gus's wife, a nurse who'd worked in Darby for 30 years, 52 years old, with the kind of competence that came from seeing people at their worst and learning how to help anyway. She found me installing the windows, 4 of them on the south-facing side, positioned to catch low winter sun. She watched me work for a few minutes before speaking. "My husband thinks you're making a terrible mistake." "I know what your husband thinks." Ida smiled slightly. "Gus is usually right about construction. He's built beautiful cabins that have sheltered families for decades. But I'm a nurse. I know what cold air does to children with respiratory problems." I stopped working and turned to face her. She was looking at the curved interior at the thermal mass bench I'd finished building at the rocket stove that was almost complete. "This might actually work," she said quietly. "It will work." She met my eyes. "Prove my husband wrong, because that little girl needs this to work." Lori was pregnant. We hadn't told anyone yet, but I could see it in the way she moved, the way she rested her hand on her stomach when she thought I wasn't looking. Another child coming into a world where winter could kill. Another reason to get this right. Another weight on decisions that already felt like they could crush me if I let myself think too long about consequences. We worked together through September. She helped me install the interior planking. She sewed curtains for the windows, thick fabric that would add another layer of insulation at night. She made that metal tunnel start to feel like something that could be a home. Nora drew pictures that we hung on the walls, flowers, animals, stick figures of our family inside a curved space that she colored with bright sunshine. The vestibule entrance was the last major piece, a double-door system that created an airlock. You'd open the outer door, step into a small space, close that door, then open the inner door. The buffer prevented cold air from rushing straight into the living space every time someone entered or left. Small details like that were the difference between a structure that worked and one that failed when it mattered. I'd seen too many buildings in the Aleutians where someone had overlooked a detail and paid for it with frozen pipes or worse. Attention to the small things wasn't paranoia. It was respect for how unforgiving physics could be. By the 28th of September, the Quonset was complete, weather-tight, insulated, the thermal mass floor cured and ready. The rocket stove tested and working exactly as I'd calculated. We moved our belongings from the temporary shelter into our new home on a cool afternoon when the first hints of autumn were showing in the cottonwood leaves. Nora ran from one end to the other, her voice echoing slightly off the curved walls. "It's warm already." Even without fire, she was right. The September sun had warmed the metal exterior enough that the thermal mass was holding ambient heat. The interior was 60 degrees, while the outside air was 55. Just 5 degrees of passive gain, but it proved the concept. Heat in heat held heat released slowly. The system worked. Word continued to spread. The war veteran living in a metal tunnel. The family that thought they could survive Montana winter in a glorified storage shed. People started finding excuses to drive past our land, slowing down to stare at the structure that looked so wrong compared to everything they knew. Some waved. Most just looked. I didn't care about their opinions. I cared about keeping my daughter alive and my family warm. Everything else was noise. Everett stopped by with a cord and a half of seasoned wood. "This is for when that stove of yours can't keep up." I appreciated the gesture even though I knew I wouldn't need that much. His doubt was honest, not malicious. "I'll burn maybe 2 cords all winter," I said. Everett looked at the size of the space, at the small rocket stove, at the relatively thin walls compared to log construction. He didn't say I was wrong. He just said, "Winter has a way of teaching lessons." The first snow came early in November. Just a dusting, nothing serious, but it was a reminder that the real test was coming. Lori and I stood outside one evening watching snow fall through the pines. She slipped her hand into mine. "Are you scared?" I nodded, terrified. She squeezed my hand. "Me too, but I trust you." That trust was everything, and it was crushing. If I was wrong, if my calculations were off, if I'd missed something important, my family would pay the price. Nora's lungs couldn't handle prolonged exposure to cold. The baby Lori was carrying needed stability and warmth. I'd bet everything on physics and engineering knowledge gained in circumstances that were similar but not identical to what we were facing. Similar wasn't the same. The town meeting happened in early December. We hadn't planned to go. Lori didn't want to face the community's judgment. But we needed to coordinate a supply run before heavy snow closed the roads, and the meeting was where those logistics got handled. Ida had agreed to watch Nora. We drove into Darby on a cold evening when the temperature was already dropping toward the teens. The town hall was packed. Farmers, ranchers, trappers, families who'd been in the valley for generations. Everyone knew everyone else. Everyone knew what everyone else thought about most things. There wasn't much privacy in a community this small. The meeting covered the usual business: road maintenance schedules, shared equipment logistics, who needed help with what. Then Gus stood up. His presence commanded attention even before he spoke. He was the elder statesman of local construction, the man people trusted with their shelter and their lives. "Before we close, I want to address something that's been on my mind. We've got a situation that could turn into tragedy, and I believe we have a responsibility to speak up." The room went quiet. Every face turned toward Gus. "Garrett Thorne is planning to winter in that metal structure up near the Bitterroots. I've inspected it. I've examined the construction. I'm telling you right now, as someone who's built through 35 Montana winters, that shelter is dangerous." The words hung in the air like smoke. Gus continued, "That metal will conduct cold faster than anything. He's got maybe 3 inches of sawdust between his family and the night air. He's planning to heat it with a stove the size of a milk can. It's not enough. Not for 40 below. Not for the wind we get up there." I felt every eye in the room shift toward me. Gus's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "I'm not saying this to embarrass anyone. I'm saying it because that man has a wife and a child, and from what Ida tells me, another baby coming. They deserve better than an experiment that's going to fail when it matters most." Fletcher stood up. "I've seen the structure too. It's not just the metal. The whole design is wrong. You can't fight Montana winter with curves and clever tricks. You fight it with mass thickness proven methods that have kept people alive since before we had fancy words for heat transfer." Lucinda Hartwell, the 70-year-old widow everyone respected, added her voice. "My grandparents built their cabin in 1891. They survived winters that killed livestock and froze wells solid. That cabin is still standing because it was built right, built with respect for what winter can do. This metal shelter seems like disrespect, like thinking you're smarter than everyone who came before." Laurie's hand found mine under the table. She was trembling slightly. I could feel the room turning, feel the judgment solidifying into something harder than doubt. This wasn't just about construction anymore. It was about identity, about whether modern ideas could replace traditional wisdom, about whether someone who'd been gone for years fighting a war still understood Montana. Gus delivered his final assessment. "I've offered to let the Thornes use my line cabin up Lost Horse Creek. It's small, but it's solid log construction with a real fireplace. I'd rather see them safe than stubborn." He looked directly at me. "This isn't personal, Garrett. You did good work in the service. But war experience doesn't translate to wilderness survival. That curved shed might have worked in the Pacific, but this is Montana. Different animal entirely." I stood up slowly. Every eye in the room locked onto me. The weight of their expectation, their certainty that I was wrong, their pity for my family pressed down like something physical. "I appreciate the concern, but the structure is sound. The physics are solid. My family will be fine." Gus's expression shifted to something almost sad. "Physics don't split wood at 3 in the morning when your fire dies. Physics don't keep your water from freezing. Physics is something engineers talk about in heated offices." A few people laughed. Not cruel laughter, just the sound of people who thought they understood better than I did. My voice stayed steady. "The thermal bench is 720 pounds of river stone. It holds heat for 18 hours after the fire goes out." Gus shook his head. "Have you tested that in January at 40 below with a 30-mile-per-hour wind?" The question hung unanswered because we both knew I hadn't. Then Laurie stood up. She was shaking, but her voice came out clear and strong. "My husband built structures that survived conditions worse than Montana in the Aleutian Islands. He understands heat-cold insulation and survival engineering better than anyone in this room. Nora is our daughter. We would never put her in danger. But we also can't live in fear every winter wondering if the next cold snap will be the one that triggers an attack we can't stop." The room was silent. Connie Whitmore's expression had shifted from judgment to something like understanding. Ida was nodding slightly, but most faces still showed doubt. Gus's voice softened, but his words didn't. "I respect your faith in your husband, Mrs. Thorne. But faith doesn't keep children warm. Experience does. Proven methods do. That structure is an experiment with your family's lives as the test subjects. And I've seen enough winters to know how that experiment ends." The meeting moved to other business. Laurie and I sat back down. My hand was still holding hers, and I realized I was squeezing too hard. She didn't pull away. Around us, people discussed mundane logistics while carefully not looking in our direction. We'd become the cautionary tale before the story even had an ending. When the meeting finally broke up, a few people approached with genuine concern. Offers of backup shelter, invitations to stay with families if things got bad. Everett said he'd check on us weekly once the snow got deep. The kindness hurt worse than the judgment because it came wrapped in assumption. They believed Gus. They believed 35 years of experience over 3 years of military engineering. They believed that when the real cold came, we'd either abandon our metal shed or pay the price for arrogance. We drove home in silence. The night was clear and cold enough that stars looked like ice chips scattered across black velvet. Laurie finally spoke. "They think we're going to die. Some of them think we're going to kill Nora. I kept my eyes on the road. I know. Her voice was barely a whisper. What if they're right? I pulled the truck over and turned to face her. The question deserved that much. I looked at my wife, pregnant and scared, trusting me with everything that mattered. I've measured every variable I can measure. I've calculated heat loss and heat retention. I've built the most efficient heating system possible with the materials and knowledge I have. Either the physics work or they don't. Either my understanding is correct or it isn't. I can't give you certainty. All I can give you is my best work and my promise that I didn't gamble. I calculated. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded. That's enough. We drove the rest of the way home. Nora was asleep when we arrived. Ida said she'd been perfect. No coughing, no trouble breathing. We paid her and thanked her. After she left, Lori and I stood in our curved metal home looking at our daughter sleeping peacefully. The rocket stove had burned out hours ago, but the temperature was still 58 degrees, comfortable enough to sleep without layers. The thermal mass was doing exactly what I'd designed it to do. Holding heat, releasing it slowly, keeping the air temperature stable. I had 6 weeks before the real cold would arrive. 6 weeks before January would test every calculation, every assumption, every belief I held about physics and engineering. 6 weeks to wonder if the man I'd become in war had lost touch with the reality of the place I'd grown up. Lori touched my arm. We should sleep. Tomorrow you can cut more wood. I looked at the modest stack I'd prepared. 2 cords total. Everyone else in the valley was sitting on 8 or 9. They thought I was unprepared. I thought they were wasteful. One of us was right. The other was about to learn a hard lesson. I pulled Lori close and felt her rest her head against my chest. Whatever happens, we're together. That was true. That would have to be enough. Outside, the first real winter storm was building somewhere north in Canada, gathering cold air and momentum. It would arrive in January. When it did, the entire valley would learn whether tradition or innovation deserved their faith, whether experience or understanding mattered more when survival was the only measure, whether a father's love and an engineer's knowledge could build something stronger than the wisdom of generations. The answer was already built into every rivet and stone, waiting for winter to reveal truth that words could never settle. We moved into the Quonset on the first day of December. Outside temperature held at 26 degrees as afternoon faded into evening. I lit the rocket stove for the first time as our primary heat source, watching Lori cradle Nora while both of them stared at the small fire like it held our future. The combustion chamber drew air with a sound like breathing. Wood crackled and disappeared into heat that I could already feel beginning to circulate. 18 minutes after ignition, the thermometer mounted near the door read 63 degrees. Nora slipped from her mother's arms and walked barefoot across the concrete floor. Her face transformed into pure wonder. "I'm not cold, Daddy." My feet are warm on the floor. Lori's eyes met mine across the curved space. Relief and residual fear fought for dominance in her expression. The baby inside her was just beginning to show. 2 lives depending on whether my engineering was sound or delusional. That first week of December ran temperatures between 18 and 28 degrees at night. Not severe. Just Montana autumn giving way to winter with enough warning to let people prepare. I burned the rocket stove twice daily. 2 hours in the morning while we ate breakfast and prepared for the day. 3 hours in the evening while we cooked dinner and spent time together before bed. The thermal mass bench absorbed heat during those burns and radiated it through the night. When I woke at 6 each morning before adding new wood, the interior temperature had dropped to somewhere between 59 and 64 degrees. Outside would be in the low 20s. A 40-degree differential maintained overnight with no active heat source. The physics weren't just working. They were exceeding my calculations. Nora slept through every night without coughing. That alone justified everything. Lori would check on her multiple times, old habits from Seattle where every cold snap had meant listening to our daughters struggle for breath. But here, wrapped in stable warmth, Nora's lungs stayed relaxed. Her breathing came easy and deep. She woke each morning energetic in ways we hadn't seen during previous winters. "Can we play outside in the snow?" The question came with excitement instead of the wheezing caution that used to follow cold exposure. We bundled her carefully and let her explore the white world for short periods. She'd come back inside to warmth that welcomed, instead of the shocking transition from frozen air to overheated fireplace zones that used to trigger attacks. Connie Whitmore visited on a gray afternoon when new snow was threatening. She found me splitting wood outside, adding to a stack that looked modest compared to what her husband had accumulated. "How much have you burned so far?" "About half a cord in 3 weeks." Her eyes widened slightly. "Silas has burned through a cord and a half." Her voice carried exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. "He's up twice every night feeding the fire. If he lets it die, the cabin gets so cold by morning that the water buckets have ice on top." She looked toward the Quonset. "Can I see inside?" "Of course." The contrast hit her immediately. She stepped through the double-door vestibule into air that was 61 degrees. Her breath stopped fogging. She could see Nora playing on the floor wearing just a light sweater and pants. No coat indoors. No layers upon layers fighting against cold that crept through log junctions and floor gaps. "This is really warm." Connie walked to the thermal mass bench and placed her hand on it. "It's like a radiator." The rocket stove had been out for 4 hours, but the stones were still releasing stored heat. "How is this possible?" I explained the basic physics. High-efficiency combustion, thermal mass storage, insulation preventing loss, curved shape eliminating cold spots. She listened with the expression of someone hearing about something that shouldn't work but clearly did. "Our kids are cold every night. They sleep in coats." She wasn't complaining, just stating facts that she'd accepted as normal until she saw an alternative. Nora interrupted with the brutal honesty of 5-year-olds. "You can come sleep here if you're cold." Connie smiled, but I saw her eyes go glassy. "Thank you, sweetie. That's very kind." She left shortly after walking back toward her own home, where her husband was probably splitting more wood to feed a fireplace that consumed fuel faster than it delivered comfort. That evening, Lori mentioned that Connie had looked close to tears. Not from sadness exactly, from the realization that survival didn't have to be as hard as she'd been making it. The town's judgment continued to percolate through conversations I wasn't part of. Everett told me later that people at the general store were running a quiet betting pool on when we'd give up and move to someone's cabin for the winter. Most bets clustered around mid-January. A few optimists gave us until February. Nobody was betting on us making it all the way through. The Quonset had become a test case for more than just heating efficiency. It represented whether new thinking could displace old wisdom, whether someone who'd left and come back could claim to understand Montana better than people who'd never left, whether books and equations mattered more than calloused hands and decades of experience. The valley was waiting for winter to deliver its verdict. December 20th arrived with temperatures dropping into single digits. Lori woke me before dawn with a hand on my shoulder and fear in her voice. Nora's coughing. I crossed the small space to where our daughter slept in the loft. Her breathing had a wet, labored quality. Each cough sounded like something breaking. Lori was already pulling on clothes. "We need Ida." I went out into the pre-dawn cold and drove the 3 miles to where Ida and Gus lived. The sky was still dark, but smoke from their chimney told me at least Ida was awake. She answered my knock, fully dressed medical bag already in hand, like she'd been expecting this. "How bad?" "Bad enough that I came for you." Ida examined Nora while Lori and I stood by, feeling helpless in the way parents do when their child is sick. "Bronchitis. Not pneumonia yet, but it could develop if we're not careful." "Is it because of the house? Because she's been too warm and her immune system isn't ready for the cold?" Lori's voice carried guilt underneath the fear. Ida shook her head firmly. "This is just a virus. Kids get bronchitis. It has nothing to do with your home or your parenting. But she does need to rest, stay warm and keep her airways open. No cold air, no temperature fluctuations." She looked around the Quonset like she was reassessing it. "Can you maintain steady warmth overnight?" I nodded. The thermal mass keeps us between 58 and 64 degrees, even when the stove isn't burning. Ida's professional mask slipped for just a moment. If Nora were in a traditional cabin right now, with temperature swings from 70 near the fire to 30 at floor level, with cold drafts and dry heat from an open fireplace, this bronchitis would likely become pneumonia within 48 hours. The stability you have here might save her from that. She left medicine and instructions. Keep her hydrated. Watch for fever. Come get me immediately if her breathing gets worse. As she was leaving, she paused at the door. The temperature is supposed to drop tonight. 6 degrees predicted. Maybe lower. She didn't say what she was thinking. She didn't need to. 6 degrees was cold, but not catastrophic. Not yet. Nora's illness dominated the next 2 days. Lori barely slept, checking on our daughter every hour, monitoring her breathing, administering medicine according to Ida's schedule. I maintained the rocket stove burns with mechanical precision. 2 hours morning, 3 hours evening. The thermal mass bench became a godsend. We could lay Nora on blankets near it, and she'd absorb gentle warmth without the dangerous heat that came from direct proximity to an open fire. Her cough persisted but didn't worsen. Her breathing stayed labored but didn't deteriorate into the panic-inducing wheezing that preceded serious attacks. On the second night, when outside temperature hit 6 degrees, the Quonset maintained 61 degrees inside, with Nora sleeping peacefully for 6 hours straight, the longest stretch she'd managed since getting sick. Gus showed up on the third day. He came with Ida but stayed in his truck while she checked on Nora. I watched him through the window, sitting behind the wheel, not coming to the door. His presence felt like surveillance, like waiting for confirmation of failure. Ida's examination brought cautious optimism. She's improving. No signs of pneumonia. Her lungs sound clearer than yesterday. Keep doing exactly what you've been doing. As she prepared to leave, I asked about Gus. He wanted to see how you were managing. He's worried. Not in a mean way, in the way he worries about everyone. She touched my arm briefly. This stability you've created, this consistent warmth without dangerous hot spots or cold zones, it's exactly what a sick child needs. Don't doubt that. Early January came in quietly. The first week ran temperatures from 8 to 18 degrees. Manageable cold. The kind that let people believe they understood what was coming. Nora recovered fully. Her energy returned. She started playing with the intensity that 5-year-olds bring to everything. Lori's pregnancy was showing more noticeably now. She moved with the careful deliberateness of someone carrying precious cargo. At night, lying in the loft, she'd sometimes ask if I was still worried. Always. But I'm less worried than I was. The system is performing better than I projected. She'd press closer. I trust you. Those 3 words carried more weight than any engineering calculation. Silas stopped by one afternoon with a question wrapped in curiosity. How much wood have you burned total since you moved in? I did quick mental math. About 0.8 cords since December 1st. He stood silent for a long moment. I've burned through 3 cords in the same period. And your place is warmer than mine? I nodded. He looked toward his own cabin, barely visible through the trees. Connie's exhausted. The kids are always cold. I'm working myself to death keeping that fireplace fed, and it's never enough. His voice held frustration with himself, not with me. I should have paid more attention to what you were building. I offered what I could. After winter, if you want, we can retrofit a thermal mass system into your cabin. Won't be as efficient as this, but it'll help. He thanked me and left. The sound of his axe splitting wood carried across the distance until dark. The radio brought warnings on January 21st. Arctic air mass moving south from Alberta. Expected arrival within 48 hours. Significant temperature drop likely. Duration uncertain. Lori found me checking our wood supply for the 10th time. How much do we have left? About 1.25 cords. How long will that last? If my calculations are right, through March. If they're wrong, we'll find out soon. Her hand found mine. I'm not scared anymore. That makes one of us. The admission surprised both of us. I'd been projecting confidence for so long that speaking fear aloud felt like violation of some unspoken contract. But I am scared. Because if I'm wrong, if something in my understanding is flawed, you and Nora and the baby will pay the price. Not me. I can handle being cold. But watching you suffer because I miscalculated would destroy me. Lori pulled me close. Listen to me. You haven't miscalculated. This place works. Nora is healthier than she's been in her entire life. I'm comfortable in the middle of Montana winter while pregnant. You built something remarkable. Now stop doubting it. Her certainty should have reassured me. Instead, it amplified the pressure. She believed because I'd convinced her. If that belief was misplaced, the fault was mine. The sky on the morning of January 22nd looked wrong. Not overcast in the normal way, not gray with coming snow. It had a color I'd only seen once before during a freak storm in the Aleutians. Gray-green, like old ice, like the belly of something dead. The air felt thick, compressed, as if something enormous was pressing down from above. Nora noticed it from the window. Why does the sky look sick? I didn't have an answer that wouldn't frighten her. Sometimes weather does strange things. We'll stay inside and stay warm, okay? She nodded and went back to playing, but Lori's expression told me she understood what that sky meant. Temperature started dropping at noon. 8 degrees to 5 degrees to 0. By sunset it was 12 below. By midnight it was 31 below and still falling. The wind arrived around 2 in the morning. Not the gusty, variable wind of normal storms. This was sustained push from the north that hit 45 miles per hour and stayed there. It found every structure in the valley and tested it mercilessly. In traditional cabins, it screamed through floor gaps and around window frames, creating drafts that made candle flames dance horizontal. I could hear it outside the Quonset, but the curved surface deflected it. No corners to catch, no flat faces to batter. The wind flowed over and around like water over a stone. I stayed awake that night, checking the thermometer every hour. 2 a.m. 53 degrees inside, 3 a.m. 52 degrees, 4 a.m. 51 degrees. I hadn't added wood to the rocket stove since 9 the previous evening. 7 hours with no active heat source and we'd only dropped 12 degrees. Outside was 37 below zero. Inside was 51 above. An 88-degree differential maintained by nothing but thermal mass and insulation. The physics weren't just working. They were performing exactly as the equations predicted. For the first time since the town meeting, I allowed myself to believe we might actually be right. Dawn came on January 23rd to temperatures that made old-timers invoke stories of the winter of 1886 when cattle froze standing up. The official reading at the weather station would later report 44 degrees below zero. With wind chill, it felt like 72 below. This was cold that killed livestock in barns, that froze diesel fuel solid, that turned exposed skin white in under a minute. This was the kind of cold that made people who'd lived in Montana their whole lives talk in hushed voices about survival instead of comfort. Nora woke at 6 and immediately started talking about playing in the snow. She had no concept that outside was deadly. Inside our curved metal home, the temperature was 52 degrees. Cool enough to want a sweater, but warm enough that breathing didn't hurt. I lit the rocket stove and watched the thermometer climb. 18 minutes to 62 degrees. 23 minutes to 64 degrees. 3 pieces of wood consumed. Nora danced around in her pajamas, completely unaware that she was warm while the world outside tried to kill everything living. The pounding on our door came at 7:15. Desperate. Panicked. I opened the outer vestibule door to find Connie Whitmore with all 3 of her children. They were bundled in every piece of clothing they owned, and they were still shaking. Their lips had a purple tint. Connie's face was streaked with tears that had frozen on her cheeks. Our fireplace can't keep up. The cabin is 41 degrees and dropping. The children are freezing. Lori had already moved, pulling the kids inside, wrapping them in blankets, positioning them near the thermal mass bench. How long were they that cold? All night. Silas has been burning wood as fast as he can cut it, and it's not enough. The corners of the cabin are below freezing. There's ice on the inside of the windows. The youngest, a 7-year-old boy, was crying. Why isn't our house warm like this? The question came out between chattering teeth. Connie looked around the Quonset with an expression that mixed desperation and incomprehension. How is it warm in here? You have metal walls. Everyone said metal would make it colder. Lori brought hot tea while I explained again this time to someone whose children's lives depended on understanding. Metal conducts heat, yes, but it's insulated. The curved shape eliminates cold spots. The thermal mass stores and releases heat slowly. The rocket stove delivers high efficiency. Connie wasn't really listening. She was watching her children absorb warmth, seeing color return to their faces, hearing their breathing slow from panicked gasps to normal rhythm. Silas is still trying to keep the fire going. We can't all fit at the fireplace. The kids were sleeping in coats and they were still cold. She started crying again. I thought they were going to die. I thought we'd wake up and find them frozen. The Whitmore children stayed for 4 hours. They thawed. They ate breakfast. They played with Nora like the night of terror they'd endured was already becoming a story instead of a trauma. Kids possessed that resilience. Adults carried the scars longer. When Connie finally took them home, she stood in our doorway for a long moment. Everyone was wrong about this place. You were right. I wish we'd listened. The weight of those words settled into the space after she left. Lori found me standing by the window. We just saved those children's lives. The realization hit us both. If we hadn't been here, if the Quonset hadn't worked, those kids would have spent the night in a cabin that couldn't protect them. The hypothetical consequences were horrifying. Everett Calhoun arrived on January 25th. He'd promised to check on us weekly, and he was a man who kept promises even when it meant snowshoeing 3 miles in temperatures that were still hovering around 40 below. He knocked and I opened the door to find him staring at me like I was a ghost. "You're not wearing a coat." Inside voice, not outside voice. I stepped back. "Come in. Coffee's hot." He stomped snow from his boots and stepped through the vestibule. The transformation in his expression was worth documenting. His eyes went wide. His mouth opened slightly. He pulled off his glove and held his hand up like he was checking for something invisible. "It's warm in here. Actually warm. Not just warmer than outside. Actually comfortable warm." The thermometer gave him the numbers he needed. 66 degrees inside. Outside his truck, thermometer had read 41 below. 107-degree differential. He walked to the rocket stove where a small fire burned no larger than what someone would use to heat a pot of soup. "This little thing is all you're burning." I showed him the wood I'd consumed, 13 pieces since yesterday morning. He did visible math in his head. I burned 95 pieces in the same period, 7 times as much. And his cabin, even with that massive consumption, was only reaching 52 degrees. The numbers didn't just prove a point. They humiliated every assumption the valley had made about what worked and what didn't. "How long has the fire been out?" I checked the time. "About 4 hours. Everett placed his hand on the thermal mass bench. "It's still warm, like someone's been heating it constantly. 720 pounds of river stone. Burns twice a day for a total of 5 hours. Stores heat. Releases it over the next 19 hours. He sat down on the bench and I watched decades of certainty crack across his weathered face. "Gus Brennan needs to see this. He won't believe me if I tell him." The desperation in his voice surprised me. "You need to come see it yourself because I'm looking at it and I barely believe it. Numbers don't lie." "That's what you said, right? Physics doesn't care what we think should work. It just works or it doesn't." I nodded. "Exactly." Everett stood. "I'm going to get Gus today. He needs to see this before he tells one more person you're making a mistake." Gus arrived the next morning with Everett Fletcher and 2 other builders whose names I didn't catch. They came armed with 3 thermometers like they expected mine to be faulty. Ida rode with them. Sitting in the truck bed like this was too important to miss, even in dangerous cold. Gus's face was set in an expression I couldn't read. Not hostile, not friendly, just determined. "This isn't personal, Garrett. I'm here to measure, to verify, to understand." Fair enough. They filed through the vestibule one by one. All 3 thermometers agreed. 65 degrees inside. Outside was 40 below. 105-degree differential. Gus walked the interior slowly, methodically, touching walls, feeling for drafts, checking corners. He sat on the thermal mass bench and I saw his hand press flat against the warm stone. How long since you burned 5 hours? He stood and walked to the rocket stove, examining its construction with the eye of someone who'd spent a lifetime understanding how heat worked. This burns hotter than anything I've seen. Cleaner. The J shape creates a draft that pulls air through at high velocity. Burns wood at around 1500 degrees instead of the 800 you get in an open fireplace. Hot enough to combust the smoke. Near complete combustion. Where does the heat go? Into the thermal mass bench. 720 pounds of river stone absorbing heat during the burn, releasing it slowly over 18 to 20 hours. Like a battery that charges fast and discharges slow. Gus sat heavily on the chair Lori had positioned near the stove. His face carried an expression I'd never seen on him before, the look of a man confronting the possibility that everything he'd built his life around might be wrong. "How much wood did you burn yesterday?" I showed him the modest pile. 13 pieces. Fletcher, who'd been taking notes, spoke up. "I burned 88 pieces yesterday. My cabin only reached 57 degrees. The silence that followed was profound. Ida broke it. She'd been standing near Nora watching our daughter play barefoot in comfortable warmth. 30 years as a nurse taught me to recognize when something is working. Children don't lie with their bodies. That little girl is thriving. She's healthier than she's been in her entire life." She looked at her husband. "This works, Augustus. You were wrong." The use of his full name carried weight. Gus's face transformed through several emotions too quickly to name. He looked at me, at the Quonset's curved interior, at the thermometers that all told the same truth. 35 years of experience just got contradicted by a metal shed and a stove that looked like a toy. His voice came out quiet. "I've never been this wrong about anything that mattered." No one spoke. The moment needed silence. Gus stood and walked to the thermal mass bench one more time, placed both hands on it like he was trying to absorb understanding through his palms. "This isn't just better than what I build. This is revolutionarily better. The differential in wood consumption, in comfort, in efficiency, it's not incremental improvement. It's complete transformation of what's possible." He turned to face me. "You didn't disrespect tradition. You evolved it. You asked if the old ways could be improved, and you proved they could. That takes courage I didn't give you credit for." Fletcher approached the rocket stove like it was a religious artifact. "Can you teach me how this works? I want to understand the physics, not just accept that it works. Actually understand why." I nodded. "Of course." Gus cleared his throat. "I have clients, people who've asked me to build for them. Young families, mostly. Limited budgets, but they need shelter that works." His pride was fighting with pragmatism, and I watched pragmatism win. "I'm going to recommend they talk to you first. Not because I can't build for them, but because what you're building is what they need." The offer hung in the air between us. It wasn't just an acknowledgement that I was right and he was wrong. It was an invitation to be part of the community in a way I hadn't been since returning from the war. Gus was the gatekeeper of construction wisdom in the valley. His endorsement would change everything. I appreciate that. But I think there's a middle path. You know things I don't. Traditional construction has beauty and longevity that this doesn't. What if we combined our knowledge, your experience, with my engineering? Build things that have the best of both. Gus's expression shifted to something that might have been relief. He'd been prepared to concede defeat. I was offering partnership instead. I'd like that. I'd like that very much. They stayed for another hour, measuring, documenting, asking questions. Everett kept returning to the thermal mass bench, amazed that something so simple could be so effective. The other builders studied the rocket stove's construction with newfound respect for concepts they'd dismissed weeks ago. Ida made tea and talked with Lori about pregnancy and parenting in ways that felt like acceptance instead of judgment. When they finally left, Gus paused at the door. "The cold snap is supposed to break in a few days. When it does, people are going to ask questions. They're going to want to know how you survived better than everyone else. Be patient with them. Fear makes people defensive. They weren't laughing at you because they were cruel. They were laughing because accepting you were right meant accepting they'd been wrong. That's hard for folks." After they'd gone, Lori and I stood in our home that had proven itself beyond any doubt. She leaned against me, her pregnant belly pressed between us. "You did it. You built something everyone said was impossible and you made it work." The vindication should have felt sweet. Instead, it just felt like relief, like a weight I'd been carrying since December had finally lifted. Nora interrupted our moment with perfect timing. "Can Ida come visit again? I like her. She's nice." The innocence of that statement hit harder than any adult acknowledgement. My daughter had no idea that the woman who'd just visited was married to the man who'd publicly declared our home dangerous. She just knew kindness when she saw it. Outside temperatures began their slow climb back toward survivable. The cold snap would break within 48 hours, leaving behind stories that would be told for decades. The winter when it hit 44 below, and the war veteran in the metal tunnel stayed warmer than anyone in a traditional cabin. The winter when physics beat experience and tradition had to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, the old ways weren't always the best ways. The winter when a father's love and an engineer's knowledge combined to build something that kept his daughter breathing easy through the worst cold Montana could deliver. The answer had always been there in the equations and the careful construction. Winter had simply revealed what calculation had already proven. Sometimes the best way forward requires leaving behind everything people think they know, even when doing so looks like madness to everyone watching. The cold snap broke on February 7th, leaving behind stories that would ripple through 3 counties for years. By the 5th, Everett had already begun spreading numbers that people couldn't ignore. He walked into the general store in Darby, carrying a notebook filled with measurements he'd taken obsessively over 2 weeks. The small crowd of farmers and ranchers waiting out the last of the brutal weather stopped their conversation when he pulled out his data. Garrett Thorne burned .9 cords of wood from January 22nd through February 4th. His voice carried the tone of someone reporting impossible news. I burned 4.8 cords in the same period. Silas Whitmore burned 5.7. The math isn't just better, it's devastatingly better. 78% less wood for temperatures that averaged 19 degrees warmer. The silence in that store lasted long enough that someone finally had to break it. Can't be right. Must be measuring wrong. Everett shook his head. I measured 9 times over 12 days with 3 different thermometers. Gus Brennan was there. He saw it himself. The mention of Gus's name changed the quality of the silence. If Everett Calhoun might exaggerate and if some young engineer might lie, Gus Brennan was bedrock truth. 35 years of building cabins that kept families alive didn't make mistakes about what worked. Someone asked where Gus stood on all this. Everett's answer came simple and devastating. He said he was wrong, said it straight out. Wrong about the metal, wrong about the design, wrong about thinking. Experience always beats innovation. The story spread with the velocity that only shocking truth can achieve in small communities. Connie Whitmore told everyone at the church social how 3 of her children had nearly frozen in their own beds, while Nora Thorne slept comfortable in pajamas. She wasn't complaining about her own situation. She was testifying to a miracle she'd witnessed. That metal tunnel everyone laughed at kept those kids warmer than my log cabin that's been standing 20 years. Her voice held wonder instead of bitterness. We built what our parents built and their parents before them, and we never asked if there was a better way. Now we know there is. Ida spoke to anyone who'd listen about Nora's health transformation. I've been a nurse in this valley for 30 years. I've seen children with respiratory problems struggle every winter. That little girl is thriving in ways I didn't think possible. She paused before delivering the line that would get repeated in conversations for months. Her father didn't just build a warm house. He built a healthy house. There's a difference, and we should all be paying attention to it. The statement carried weight because Ida Brennan didn't offer opinions lightly. When she spoke about health, people believed. Lucinda Hartwell, the 70-year-old widow who'd invoked her grandparents' cabin at the town meeting, made the observation that cut deepest. My grandparents built with what they knew, and it worked well enough that their children survived to have children of their own. But well enough isn't the same as best possible. They did what they could with what they understood. This young man understood more, and he built better. That's not disrespect. That's progress honoring the past by improving on it. Coming from someone whose entire identity was wrapped in generational continuity, the endorsement mattered more than any engineering explanation could. Gus stayed away from public spaces for a week after the cold snap broke. People noticed his absence the way they'd notice a mountain disappearing from the landscape. Fletcher told customers at the lumber yard that his father was thinking, processing, working through something that challenged everything he'd built his reputation on. The explanation satisfied most people because they understood that kind of crisis. Having your life's work questioned wasn't something you recovered from in an afternoon. It required time and solitude and the kind of honesty that hurt before it healed. Silas Whitmore showed up at the Quonset in mid-February with an apology that came harder than any physical labor he'd ever performed. "I judged you, publicly and privately. I thought you were being reckless with your family." The words came slow and careful. "I was wrong and I'm sorry. That night when Connie brought the kids to you, when I realized they were safer in your home than in mine, it broke something in me. Not in a bad way, in the way things break when they need to reshape into something better." He looked around the curved interior with new appreciation. "Can you teach me? Not to build this exactly, but to understand the principles. So maybe I can improve what I've got." The request represented more than personal education. It signaled a shift in how the Valley thought about knowledge transfer. Traditionally, skills moved from father to son, from master to apprentice, through demonstration and repetition. What Silas was asking for was different. He wanted theoretical understanding that he could adapt to his own circumstances. He wanted to know why things worked instead of just accepting that they did. That's a different kind of learning, and it requires a different kind of teaching. We started that afternoon with basic thermodynamics explained through examples he could touch and feel. By evening, he understood heat capacity and thermal bridging well enough to sketch modifications for his own cabin. Fletcher Brennan became the first official student of what would eventually become an informal teaching system. He arrived 3 times a week through late February and early March, notebook in hand, ready to learn physics that his father had never needed to know. The younger Brennan possessed something valuable. He could hold respect for traditional methods and openness to innovation in the same thought without either canceling the other. "This is what my father built with." He'd indicate dovetailed log joints or specific chinking techniques. "It's beautiful, it works, but it's not optimal for heat retention." Then he'd ask about convection patterns or insulation R values with genuine hunger to understand. Teaching him felt less like replacing old knowledge and more like adding new tools to an existing craftsman's kit. The first request for new construction came from a young couple in Stevensville who'd heard about the Quonset through friends of friends. They drove the 40 miles to see it in person, bringing their 2 small children and a budget that would barely cover materials for a modest traditional cabin. The husband, whose name was Daniel Morrison, walked around the exterior while his wife Angela watched their kids play with Nora inside. "This really stays warm on what you're burning." I showed him my wood consumption records. He did calculations on paper he'd brought. "We're spending nearly all our money on firewood every winter. If this could cut that by even half, we could save enough to send the kids to school properly." The decision they faced wasn't about aesthetics or tradition. It was about whether efficiency could buy them a different kind of future. I offered them something different than a straight Quonset copy. "Your budget is tight, but you want something that looks more traditional from outside. What if we build a hybrid log wall construction for appearance and cultural fit, but with a curved metal roof for convection benefits? Add a thermal mass floor and a rocket stove system. You'll get maybe 60% of the efficiency I've achieved, but at 70% of the cost of what Gus would charge for traditional construction." Angela's face transformed. "We could afford that. We could actually afford to be warm and to save money." The revelation hit her like she was seeing color for the first time. Daniel extended his hand for a shake that sealed more than a business arrangement. It sealed trust that new ways could serve old needs. Gus came back to the Quonset in late March on an afternoon when early spring was tentatively suggesting that winter might actually end. Ida rode with him, and their arrival felt significant in ways that went beyond simple visiting. Gus stood on our threshold with his hat in his hands like a supplicant instead of the master builder everyone deferred to. "Garrett, I need to say some things." I let him in. Lori made coffee while Nora showed Ida a drawing she'd made. The domestic normality provided cover for a conversation that clearly cost Gus something to initiate. "I was wrong about your structure. Not just wrong, profoundly, completely wrong in ways that call into question my entire approach to building." His voice carried none of the defensive justification that often accompanies admission of error. 35 years of experience made me arrogant. I believed that because I'd built things that worked, I was building things that couldn't be improved. You proved otherwise. Lori set coffee in front of him, but he didn't drink it immediately. He seemed to need to finish the thought before allowing himself comfort. "What you've accomplished here isn't just a better cabin. It's a demonstration that engineering knowledge and careful thought can outperform accumulated tradition. That's humbling. It should be humbling. And I'm grateful you showed it to me even though it hurt to learn. The apology was generous, but I couldn't let it stand alone. You taught me something too, whether you meant to or not." I explained carefully, wanting him to hear it. "Tradition exists because it worked well enough to be passed down. Your cabins have kept families alive for decades. What I built works better for specific metrics, but it doesn't have the beauty your work has. It doesn't connect people to their history the way log construction does. Efficiency isn't the only measure of value. What we should be aiming for is synthesis, taking the best of what you know and the best of what I know and building something neither of us could build alone." Gus's expression shifted through several emotions before settling on something like relief. "You're offering partnership instead of replacement." The realization seemed to ease some burden he'd been carrying. "I have clients who've asked me to build for them. Young families mostly. Tight budgets. They need shelter that works more than shelter that looks perfect." His pride warred visibly with pragmatism before pragmatism won. "I'm going to recommend they talk to you first. Not because I can't serve them, but because what you're building is what they actually need given their circumstances." The offer represented more than business referral. Gus Brennan's endorsement would legitimize my work in ways that successful construction never could on its own. But I pushed back gently. "Don't send them to me instead of you. Send them to both of us working together. You understand timber framing, traditional joinery, how to make buildings that last generations. I understand thermodynamics and efficient heating. Combine those, and we build something better than either of us achieves separately. The hybrid design I'm developing for the Morrisons needs your expertise on the structural timber work. I can handle the mechanical systems and insulation, but I need someone who knows how to make log construction actually work long-term." Gus studied me for a long moment before responding. "You could have taken this moment to crow, to prove you were right and I was foolish. Instead, you're offering to learn from me while teaching me. That's rare. That's the kind of character this valley needs more of." He extended his hand and we shook. "Partners then. I'll bring timber knowledge. You bring thermal engineering. We'll build things that keep people warm and beautiful enough that they want to stay." The agreement felt like more than professional collaboration. It felt like the valley itself deciding that the future didn't have to erase the past. It could build on it instead. Ida pulled Lori aside while Gus and I discussed the Morrison project. Their conversation was quieter, but I caught fragments. "You trusted your husband when everyone else doubted." Ida's voice held admiration. "That takes a special kind of strength." Lori's response came softer. "I was terrified. Every day I wondered if I was putting my daughter at risk by believing him. But I loved him more than I feared being wrong." Ida touched Lori's pregnant belly gently. "That baby is going to be born into a warm home built by parents who understand that love means taking calculated risks instead of accepting comfortable failure." The two women embraced in a way that bridged generations and philosophies. Fletcher arrived as Gus was leaving. Father and son stood together looking at the Quonset from outside. I watched through the window as Gus explained something, gesturing at the curved roof at the vestibule entrance at details he'd dismissed months ago and was now studying with new eyes. Fletcher took notes. The image of them learning together, the master builder humbled enough to become student alongside his apprentice, struck me as the best possible outcome. innovation didn't require destroying what came before. It required being humble enough to say the two words that unlock all progress we can improve. Spring work began in April with 3 simultaneous projects: the Morrison's hybrid cabin, a retrofit thermal mass system for Silas Whitmore's existing structure, a full Quonset build for a widow named Constance Hall who'd spent the winter burning through her late husband's savings trying to stay warm. Each project taught lessons that informed the others. The Morrison hybrid revealed that log construction could coexist with efficient heating if you eliminated thermal bridges and added proper insulation layers. The Whitmore retrofit proved that existing cabins could be upgraded without complete reconstruction. Constance Hall's Quonset demonstrated that the basic design could scale for single occupants as efficiently as it worked for families. Fletcher proved invaluable across all 3 sites. He possessed his father's skill with timber and an engineer's hunger for understanding why specific approaches worked. Teaching him felt less like training an employee and more like preparing someone to carry knowledge forward after I was gone. By May, he could explain thermal mass principles to clients better than I could because he translated physics into the language of traditional building that people already understood. Your fireplace pushes heat up the chimney. What we're building pulls it into stone and releases it slow. Same fire, different result. The explanation worked because it honored what people knew while showing them how to make it better. Everett Calhoun tackled his own retrofit with characteristic independence. He spent 2 weeks modifying his cabin's existing fireplace, adding a thermal mass bench made from creek stones, improving insulation around window frames, and installing a simple convection system that moved warm air from ceiling height to floor level. The modifications were crude compared to what Gus and I were building for clients, but they worked. He reported cutting his wood consumption by 35% while increasing comfort significantly. Not perfect, not revolutionary, but better than what I had, and that's worth the labor. His pragmatism represented the Valley's emerging philosophy. Optimal might be impossible, but improved was always achievable. Summer brought requests that exceeded our capacity to fulfill immediately. 7 families wanted full Quonset builds. 11 wanted hybrid designs. 4 wanted retrofits of existing structures. Gus and I developed a waiting list and a classification system. Emergency cases went first. Young families with children. Elderly people living alone. Anyone whose current shelter was borderline dangerous. Comfort upgrades for people who could afford to wait came second. Purely aesthetic projects went last, though we had few of those. Most people seeking our services needed efficiency more than beauty. They needed to stop burning through money and labor just to achieve marginal warmth. Nora became an unexpected ambassador for the work we were doing. She'd invite children who visited to feel the thermal mass bench, to watch the rocket stove burn clean, to see how warm floors felt under bare feet. "Kids are warmer in Garrett's house than anywhere else" became a statement repeated by children across the valley. Their parents couldn't ignore that kind of testimony. Whatever skepticism they maintained about engineering principles or modern methods, they couldn't dismiss their own children reporting being genuinely comfortable instead of just surviving winter. The truth spoken by 5-year-olds carried weight that no amount of data could match. The baby arrived in July. A son we named Samuel, healthy and loud and completely unaware that he'd been born into a house that represented victory over doubt and physics applied with love. Lori held him in the loft where she'd spent last winter, warm and safe, where Nora had slept through brutal cold without coughing. This home protected us. Now it'll protect him too. The continuity mattered. We were building something that would outlast our own need for it, something that could shelter our children and maybe their children if they chose to stay in the valley. The first winter after the cold snap brought different expectations. November 1848 arrived with 21 structures across 3 counties incorporating thermal mass principles. 9 were complete Quonset builds. 12 were hybrid designs combining traditional construction with efficient heating. Every single one consumed drastically less wood than traditional cabins while delivering superior comfort. The data was consistent across climate microclimates, across builder skill levels, across variations in implementation. The physics worked because physics didn't care about who applied it or where. It just worked. Gus and I documented everything. We created building guides that explained not just what to do, but why it worked. Fletcher helped write instructions that translated engineering concepts into craftsman language. This isn't meant to replace what your father taught you. This is meant to add to it so you can build better while honoring where you came from. The guides spread beyond our immediate valley. Copies traveled to other Montana communities, to Idaho, to northern Wyoming. Anywhere that winter was brutal and firewood expensive, people wanted to know how to achieve more with less. The Morrison family invited us to their completed hybrid cabin in December. Their 2 children ran through spaces that held steady warmth while Daniel and Angela showed us details they'd customized. We added carved window frames like Angela's grandmother had in Norway. Traditional aesthetics meeting modern function. The pride in their voices wasn't just about having shelter. It was about having built something that honored where they came from while serving where they were going. That synthesis was what Gus and I had aimed for, and seeing it achieved by others felt like validation beyond any engineering test. Nora never had another serious respiratory incident. The stability of temperature, the absence of cold drafts, the consistent humidity that thermal mass naturally regulated, all of it combined to create an environment where her lungs could simply function normally. Ida documented the improvement in notes that would later inform recommendations for other families with medically fragile children. Environmental consistency matters as much as medicine for respiratory conditions. We can build health into structures if we're willing to think differently about what shelter means. Her observations married her nursing knowledge with structural innovation in ways that expanded both fields. Winter 1849 through 1950 proved the sustainability of what we'd started. None of the structures we'd built failed. None of the families regretted choosing efficiency over tradition. Wood consumption across the valley dropped by an average of 48% for families using thermal mass systems. 48% translated to saved money, saved labor, saved forest resources. It translated to mothers who didn't spend all winter exhausted from maintaining inadequate heat, to children who didn't sleep in coats, to elderly people who didn't face the choice between buying food or buying firewood. The mathematics of improvement calculated out in human comfort and dignity. Gus never returned to building purely traditional cabins. He'd been prepared to maintain both approaches, keeping the old for clients who wanted it while offering the new for those who needed it. But every client who came to him, once they understood the difference in performance, chose innovation. Some asked for more traditional aesthetics applied to efficient structures. Others embraced the Quonset form factor completely. None chose beauty over warmth once they understood they didn't have to sacrifice either. That's when I knew the old ways were really gone. Gus told me one afternoon in early spring of 1950. Not because someone forbade them, because they couldn't compete once people saw what was possible. Fletcher eventually established his own practice building exclusively hybrid structures that looked traditional from outside while incorporating every efficient heating principle we could devise. He became the next generation's bridge between past and future, teaching apprentices his own age that respecting tradition meant making it better rather than fossilizing it. By 1952, he'd built more hybrid cabins than his father had built traditional ones in a decade. The skill hadn't diminished. It had evolved. I continued living in the original Quonset until 1964, when our family had grown to 5 children and we needed more space. We built a larger home using principles refined over 15 years of iteration and learning, but we kept the Quonset as a workshop and guest quarters because it still performed flawlessly. The structure that everyone had mocked as a metal coffin stood solid and efficient through 17 winters, proving that good engineering doesn't degrade. It just keeps working. A graduate student from Montana State University arrived in 1982 researching vernacular architecture adaptations in cold climates. He'd heard about the Bitterroot Valley's unusually high concentration of efficient housing and wanted to document it. His thesis eventually mapped 21 full Quonset structures and 51 traditional cabins modified with thermal mass systems, all traceable to that first winter when physics confronted tradition and won. His conclusion was simple but significant. Thorne's innovation reduced average winter heating requirements by 68%, compared to contemporary traditional construction while improving thermal comfort and reducing labor. The adoption rate correlated directly with exposure to empirical data during the 1948 cold snap. Translation: people believed the numbers when they couldn't deny them anymore. Gus passed away in 1977 at age 80. He'd spent his final decade building hybrid structures that married his love of timber craftsmanship with the thermal engineering he'd once dismissed. His funeral drew people from across western Montana. Builder after builder stood to say that Gus Brennan had taught them not just how to construct shelter, but how to remain humble enough to learn when you'd been wrong. Fletcher gave the eulogy with words his father had spoken to him privately. "The best cabins I ever built were the ones where I combined what my father taught me with what Garrett Thorne showed me was possible. That's not betrayal of tradition, that's tradition living instead of dying." I wept at that funeral for a man who'd been brave enough to admit error and generous enough to become student after decades as master. I'm 74 now, sitting in the original Quonset that serves as my workshop. Nora visited yesterday with her own children. She's 50, healthy, hasn't had respiratory problems since childhood. She brought her 12-year-old daughter, who asked to see where Grandma grew up. This is it. This curved metal space that everyone thought would kill us. Nora walked her daughter through the structure, explaining how the thermal mass works, how the rocket stove burns, how the shape eliminates cold pockets. I remember the night the Whitmore kids came because they were freezing. I remember feeling safe here when the whole world outside was trying to freeze solid. Her voice held wonder at recovered memory. That's when I knew our house was special. Not because it looked different, because it worked when nothing else did. Lori is 72 now, still strong, still the foundation that held when I needed belief more than validation. She brought tea out to the workshop where I sit most afternoons. "Do you remember the night I cried because I was so scared you were wrong?" I nodded. "You weren't the only one scared. I was terrified. But you were more scared of losing Nora than you were of being right. That's when fear becomes courage. When you're more afraid of the consequences of inaction than the consequences of trying something everyone says is impossible." She sat beside me on the thermal mass bench that's still releasing gentle heat from the afternoon sun warming the metal exterior. This stone is still warm, 46 years later, and it's still doing what you designed it to do. Nora's daughter asked the question that children always ask when they don't yet understand that adults are supposed to have everything figured out. "Were you scared when everyone laughed at you?" "Grandpa?" I thought about lying, about pretending confidence I'd never actually felt. But she deserved honesty. "Yes, very scared. Scared that I was risking your grandmother and your mother on calculations that might be wrong. Scared that pride was making me stubborn instead of wise. But I was more scared of what would happen if we built what everyone said was safe and it wasn't actually safe enough. Sometimes being scared of the right things is braver than not being scared at all." The Quonset still stands exactly as I built it, 46 years without major repairs. The metal has weathered, but the insulation remains effective. The thermal mass bench still warms the space hours after the sun sets. Even now, without fire burning, the interior temperature is 62 degrees, while the March evening outside is 47. A 15-degree passive gain from nothing but design and material selection. The physics never stopped working because physics doesn't care about time or validation. It just continues to be true whether anyone believes it or not. Samuel, the baby born in that first summer after the cold snap, teaches engineering at the University of Montana now. He grew up understanding that the built environment is applied physics made shelter. That comfort isn't luck or tradition. It's understanding heat transfer and applying that understanding with care. He's studying net zero housing now, pushing toward futures I never imagined, standing on foundations I helped lay by, asking whether better was possible. The chain continues. Knowledge builds on knowledge. Each generation asks what can be improved and has the courage to try even when trying looks like arrogance to everyone watching. Lori took my hand as the sun finished setting. "You changed this valley, not by forcing anything, just by building something that worked so obviously better that people couldn't ignore it." Her grip was still strong after all these years. That's how real change happens. Not through argument, through demonstration so clear that even doubt has to surrender. I leaned into her warmth. We changed it together. You gave me the trust to try. That mattered more than any engineering knowledge. Without your belief, I would have given up when Gus declared us foolish. Without your strength, I would have accepted comfortable failure instead of risking uncomfortable success. The thermal mass bench under us radiated warmth absorbed from the afternoon sun. 720 pounds of river stone doing what they'd been doing for 46 years. Storing heat, releasing it slowly, serving the purpose they'd been carefully selected and positioned to serve. I placed my hand flat against the smooth surface. These stones taught me something beyond thermodynamics. Heat isn't lost. It's just transferred. Energy doesn't disappear. It changes form, changes location, but it persists. The warmth I put into this bench in 1948 is still here, transformed through countless cycles but fundamentally continuous. Knowledge works the same way. The understanding you gain and share doesn't vanish. It transfers to others, transforms through their application, but persists as long as anyone carries it forward. Nora's daughter was examining the rocket stove, trying to understand how something so small could have heated the entire space. The J shape looks weird. Why not just a straight pipe? Because straight paths are efficient for some things, but not for extracting maximum heat from combustion. I explained it to her the way I'd explained to her mother decades ago, the way I'd explained to Fletcher and hundreds of others over the years. The curve creates velocity. Velocity creates heat. Heat transfers to mass. Mass radiates over time. Simple principles applied carefully compound into extraordinary results. She nodded, understanding dawning in her young face. So small changes in how you build things can make huge differences in how they work. Exactly. That's the whole lesson. Never assume that because something has always been done one way that it's the best way possible. The light through the windows turned golden as it does in March evenings when winter is finally releasing its grip. I thought about February 1948 when temperatures hit 44 below and everyone expected to find us frozen. I thought about Gus Brennan's courage in admitting he'd been wrong, about Ida believing when her husband doubted, about Connie Whitmore's children warming themselves on this very bench after nearly freezing in a cabin that was built correctly according to tradition but inadequately according to physics. About Fletcher learning to combine his father's craft with innovation his father had initially rejected. About the valley slowly transforming as demonstration proved more persuasive than argument ever could. Every person who chose efficiency over familiarity. Every family that decided comfort mattered more than appearance. Every builder who learned that honoring the past meant improving on it rather than merely repeating it. Lori stood and pulled me up with her. Come inside the big house. I made stew and Samuel is driving up for dinner. Your daughter and granddaughter are staying too. Family dinner in a home built on principles proven in this workshop. I took one last look at the Quonset's curved interior, the shape that everyone had mocked, the design that had seemed like insanity to experienced builders who'd survived 40 Montana winters doing it the hard way. The structure that had taught an entire valley that tradition deserves respect, but not worship. That experience informs but shouldn't constrain. That the best way to honor those who came before is to build on what they knew instead of being limited by it. We walked together toward the larger house where our children and grandchildren waited. Behind us the original Quonset held its warmth against the cooling evening, proving still after all these years that asking whether something can be better is the most important question any of us can ask. And having the courage to attempt an answer, even when everyone watching thinks you're wrong, is how progress stops being theoretical and starts being shelter that keeps people warm when the world outside tries its hardest to freeze everything living. Sometimes the best solutions come from the most unexpected places. Sometimes physics beats tradition. And sometimes love drives innovation harder than any other force available to human effort. That's not theory. That's just truth, staying warm in metal and stone and memory, waiting for anyone humble enough to learn what winter tried so hard to teach.